I think that I was like, oh, this is like the most valuable, this is the most valuable information around building inclusive camping communities that we can have. So I was delighted when Chris agreed to come speak to this group. And so I don't actually know Chris that well, but I feel like I do because I've heard him talk a couple times. And but I will tell you some things that he told me about himself. So Chris has worked as the director at a camp in Ohio for 7 years, and it's called Kinjackety.
Yep.
Yes,
You got it.
Kinjackety, and also has worked just in like youth development and camping ministries for 18 years, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Chris is really involved in his church community, both like in social justice initiatives and also as a person who gets to mow the lawn. A neat thing is that Chris produces maple syrup and also makes wine. So very back to the earth with the two most delicious things, alcohol and maple syrup. So yeah, other than that, I think I'll just let Chris explain anything else he wants to about himself. But I'm so delighted that he's going to present to us all tonight. So thanks for being here.
Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. Like Vicky said, my name is Chris Rehs-Dupin. I talk way too fast. I use the pronouns he, him, his, and I'm a trainer and consultant with an organization called Transplaining. And what we're about is working to create a safer world for transgender youth and adults through training, community conversations, and all of that grounded in empathetic guidance. So I am a transgender man. I spent 32 years of my life living in a body and with an identity that didn't quite feel right, and then kind of realized who I was and wanted to shout it from the rooftops and make sure that other people didn't have to live that long not knowing who they were or being afraid of who they were. So I worked in the camping industry for 18 years. I held every position from bunk counselor to camp director. You know, I made ranch dressing in huge vats. So I've been there, I've done it. I know what it's like. Also, I was an American Camp Association standards instructor, visitor. So even outside my own camp, was very involved in policies. I love them. I'm a standards nerd. I used to read them on my off time. And I like standards brain teasers. I'm an odd duck. I love it. So I also believe in the power of camps to change lives and in many cases save lives. So with the high rate of LGBTQ suicidal ideation and attempts, I believe that camps can really create those safe environments that include and create ways that they are brought into community and held in safety that can undo some of the harm that we see. Okay, so right off the bat, I know it's a loaded topic. It's hard to talk about. I feel like, especially in youth work and youth organizations, for a long time we were just like, like we want to do it, we don't know how to do it, we're not going to talk about it. If people want to talk about it, we're going to tell them not to talk about it. You can be here, but we're not going to talk about you being here. So I really want to move out of that idea of like passive acceptance. The one thing, if you take away nothing else from this training tonight, is that if you are doing trans inclusive practices, don't do them in the dark. It's okay to share that. In fact, it's important to share that because you don't want to create a situation where you have a camper that comes to camp and they think that they're going to be safe, and then they're not safe because you aren't able to really back up and step up for them. So we're going to hop right in. The other thing that I want to say about tonight is this work is vast. I mean, I do 12 months of courses preparing folks, the really nitty gritty, the details. And I wish I could do it in an hour. I wish it was that simple. Unfortunately, it's not. So again, I'm going to talk really fast, try to get through as much of it as I can, but do hold your questions to the end. And we'll take some questions once we get there. So we are all a product of a really biased system that privileges many, but it also oppresses many. So it's not entirely our fault that the system was constructed this way or that we exist in it in this way, but it is our responsibility to dismantle anything that is part of the problem, right? So there's no such thing as the idea of social justice neutral. Anytime you try to remain neutral, you're always going to be erring on the side of whoever is in power. So whoever's making those decisions. And oftentimes that leaves minority and minoritized communities kind of out in the cold, out in the dust, to kind of try to figure out their own things, which can be very different. So there's always been and is never going to be an acceptable reason to uphold systems of oppression. So like I didn't allow my camp staff to say, we've always done it this way. And so we don't allow our staff to say that, right? Like we want to challenge them and we want them to go outside of their comfort zones and rethink things. And we also want to do that about social systems that are disadvantaging some, what times are we saying, well, it's always been this way, so we're just going to keep doing it this way. So kind of keep that in your mind as we're having this conversation. However, one of the things that we really pride ourselves on is we don't want to create an environment where we're shaming folks. Shame does no one any good. It actually shuts down conversation instead of building up conversation. As an organization, our main responsibility is to help you make your corner of the world a safer place for transgender and gender nonconforming folks. So as long as you're willing to learn and have conversations, we are down to do the education piece and really try to meet you where you are. As long as you're working on growing, we want to be there with you. Now, that being said, I am a person, I'm a transgender man, and something that I'm not really willing to do is argue about the existence or the validity of transgender people, whether we exist, whether we don't exist. We do exist, and that has been, established in scientific practices. So if that's not where you are, if you're still questioning, like, are trans girls, and we're going to get into some of the language of this, like I'm not willing to have that conversation. However, there's incredible resources out there. And if you really want to look towards inclusion and you're not quite here yet, I really encourage you to do that. I encourage you to find someone who identifies themselves as an ally to the trans community who can help you with that. As a transgender man, obviously that would be a very difficult conversation for me to have about the validity of my own humanity. So we wanted to really define like what that means to us. What are the things, like what are the cornerstones of our organization that are just, we're not going to argue about them. And we kind of came up with this list. So that list is trans girls are girls. Trans girls who were assigned male at birth, who are transitioning or are female, so they're becoming girls. They're girls. Same with trans boys. Trans boys are people who were assigned male at birth, assigned female at birth, but are boys. So trans boys are boys. The part of this that really gets kind of messy and mucky is trans girls are girls, whether or not their parents agree or give them permission, or whether your camp gives them permission, like they're a girl. And if you kind of ground it in that idea that this person is just a girl, now we have to figure out how to keep her safe, it makes the conversation a little bit easier. Non-binary identities exist and are valid, and they is an acceptable singular pronoun. So a lot of times we see people say like, well, they is just not, it's just not right. It's just not grammatically correct, which is, where are we grounding our facts? But Merriam-Webster, they was the word of the year a couple of years ago as a singular pronoun. For people who are identifying as non-binary. And also we use they in speech all the time as a singular person, like they left their water bottle. If we don't know the gender of a person, we would say they left their water bottle. We say that about campers all the time because they leave their water bottles everywhere. So there's no reason really to, number one, grammar is saying that this is okay. Like, right, the people in the high tower who make these decisions are saying it's okay. And even if they weren't saying it's okay, there's no reason to argue grammar over someone's safety and over the way someone feels safest and most comfortable to be addressed. LGBTQIA people should not be treated as controversial just for existing. When we go back to that erasure that I was talking about earlier, that we don't want to talk about this, we don't want people to talk about this, like come to our camp, but like as long as you can hide it, we're going to be fine with it. Like that is a way to make a person feel like they're a burden, like they're a liability. And when you think about what that must feel like for someone, and especially staff members who love your camp, they love being a part of your camp. They're working hard for your camp. Their blood, sweat, tears, all literally giving to this camp. And then you're like, yeah, but you can't talk about like who you are. It creates almost a type of trauma for folks when they feel like they can't be who they are with a place that they really love. So the safety of transgender and gender nonconforming people should be prioritized over the discomfort of others. And we talk about this a lot, like there is a fundamental difference between safety and comfort. And sometimes what people are saying is, I wouldn't feel comfortable in this situation, when we have a trans kid who's saying, I want to be safe in this situation. And because there's less trans kids, often we kind of take the comfort over the safety. And those two things are very different. This is another big thing that we've been talking about like a lot in social justice movements. And that is, decisions should not be made about trans inclusion without the voices of trans people. So when you think about these decisions, if you're going this way, if this is an avenue that you want to walk down with your camp, whose voices are you including in the conversation? As a person who has a lived experience as a trans person, I'm gonna think about things that you all might not think about. You're gonna think about things as, the person who signs the purchase orders that I'm gonna think about. Everybody has a point of reference, and until we have all of the voices represented, it's not going to be a fair situation. So often we just hear like, nope, we're not doing it that way for trans people, and that's it. And they never asked or got the opinion of a trans person, or a trans voice was never involved in the conversation. And it's really easy to say, no, these people don't deserve to be involved, when those people were in the conversation to begin with. So this is the hardest part of the presentation. It's so hard to talk through these things, but it's really important that we set the ground rules in order to frame this in a way where we can truly grow together.
Wow, that was pretty intense.
Play.
And after a lifetime of being asked to keep who I was a secret or take up less space than I deserve, it's still really hard to draw boundaries like that. But it's vital that we come to a mutual understanding about the humanity and the validity of transgender and gender nonconforming people to do this work together. Trans youth face incredible hardships, and although they prove their resilience time and time again, sometimes their hope wears thin. In schools, 77% of those who were out or perceived as transgender were verbally harassed, 24% were physically attacked, and 13% were sexually assaulted. 61% of transgender and non-binary youth have been discouraged or prevented from using a bathroom that corresponds with their gender identity, which is up 3% since 2019. In their homes, only 51% of trans and non-binary youth feel safe enough to share their identity with their parents, and only 1 in 3 find acceptance there. With at-home acceptance rates so low, it's no surprise that 38% of transgender and non-binary youth have experienced housing instability, while shelters are being told they don't have to open their doors to transgender people. And almost half of trans and non-binary youth who have wanted to receive mental health care don't seek treatment due to concerns that they wouldn't be able to find a trans-competent mental health provider. So with widespread mistreatment in our schools, and rejection in our homes, and our faith communities, and emergency shelters, being barred from playing sports, being afraid to seek help from a mental health provider, and even being disallowed from using a bathroom, sometimes resilience isn't enough. In the past 12 months alone, 60% of transgender youth have engaged in self-harm. 52% have seriously considered suicide, and 21% have attempted to take their own life. That's 1 in 5 who thought that they would choose death over a life of alienation and exclusion. 1 in 5. Every year. But there is good news. All we have to do is change that we believe kids and affirm who they already know that they are. Studies also show that for every context that a trans youth's name and pronouns are respected, their suicide rate is cut in half. For trans youth that have thriving and welcoming communities, their suicide rate falls to equal or below the national average. Camps can be that community. And in fact, camps must be that community. We have to stop making decisions out of fear of who we may lose and focus on who we stand to gain. For every parent who wants to fight you about gender-inclusive policies, there's a parent hoping that their child will be safe at your camp because they haven't found acceptance in their schools. And for every camper that doesn't quite understand why you want everyone to share their pronouns when you're doing introductions, there's going to be a camper who gets to use a pronoun that fits them for the first time in their lives. You are the most powerful people in the world to these kids, and they need the magic of camp just as much as anyone else. So let's get to work.
Okay, so obviously we want to ground the work that we do in facts and in figures. So we know why we're doing what we're doing. This work is incredibly hard. It takes a lot of guts and it takes a lot of heart. And so we want to always frame this conversation and in what you're doing could save lives, literally save lives of people who don't always get the care and concern that they need. So let's talk a little bit about mental health risk factors. So there's this idea that the CDC has come out with, that there are certain risk factors that people might have that could lead to suicidal ideation or behavior. And as these kind of come up on the screen, you can see how some of the things that are mental health risk factors are also things that would be more common or more prevalent in transgender youth who are being left out of their communities, kicked out of their homes, bullied in school, etc. So now, on the other side of that, something that can keep someone from engaging in risk-taking behavior, self-harm, suicidal ideation, or suicide attempts, are mental health protective factors. So they're the things that mitigate the risk, mitigate those risk factors. Connectedness and community, skills in problem solving, belief that supports instincts for self-preservation, and communities that support the needs and safety of all of its members equally. And I think it's the beautiful thing about this, the risk factor versus protective factor, is that these are things that camps are doing. This is who camps are. This is the environment that we create. This is what we do. We are professionals at creating community. So all we have to do is change just a few things in order to really mitigate some of these risk factors that are damaging young trans kids. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to breeze through the terminology because I want to make sure that we at least have a basic understanding of some of the gender terms. I don't want to get stuck there because a lot of times this conversation becomes so about terms and less about what those terms mean and what to do with them. So we always ground this conversation in these are the terms and this is why we use them the way that we use them. So cisgender is a term that means stereotypical traits, or your gender aligns with stereotypical traits of sex assigned at birth. So cisgender, it comes from the Latin word on this side, means someone who is born a girl who identifies as a girl. The reason the term cisgender was created was so we didn't say transgender and then normal gender. So you never want to phrase that in that like an othering way where it's like we have this thing and then the norm is this thing over here. So cisgender just basically means, again, you're someone who identifies as a female who was born a female. If your gender does not align with stereotypical traits of sex assigned at birth, you might be transgender, non-binary, agender, genderqueer, gender fluid, and so many other words that people choose to describe themselves. And we could talk all day about these terms. They're very complicated. Everybody kind of defines them differently. They mean lots of different things to lots of different people. And I think more than knowing what those terms mean, we need to know what to do with them, and we're going to get to that in a bit. So intersex is a condition, not an identity. So you don't identify as intersex. Intersex is an umbrella term that describes bodies that fall outside of the strict male-female binary. And there's lots of ways people can be intersex. They can have variations in chromosomes, their genitals, internal organs, like testes or ovaries. Some intersex traits are identified at birth, while others might not be discovered until puberty or later in life. So we think that this is like something that doesn't happen very often, right? Like we don't know intersex people, like it's so rare. Well, it's actually not. 1.7% of the population is intersex. And that's just as common as having green eyes or having red hair, which falls about at 2%. However, there's only 7 states. And this is in the United States. I apologize. I don't know all of the Canada stuff. I should. I'll get better. All right. So, but in the United States, there's only 7 states that allow birth certificates to not assign a mandatory M or F on birth certificates. And that's pretty recent, right? So now there are 7 states: California, Colorado, Maine, New Jersey, New York City, which is not a state, it is a city, Oregon, and Washington, D.C., that will allow you to have an X on your birth certificate if you are born with an intersex condition. So one of the saddest things about intersex conditions is that often these babies are born and they have what might be called ambiguous genitals, right? So they kind of have a little bit of both. And what happens in those situations is the doctor and the parents typically have a conference and they decide, based on what that anatomy looks like, what that kid is going to be. And then often that kid is immediately taken into surgery to make their genitals appear what we as a society would consider male or female. There's no consent. There's no reason. Like nature has created these people with these different bodies, but we are so stuck on this 2 and 2 only gender system that we're going to force them into this box, which is it just blows my mind that that's even a thing that we would do. But that just shows you how invested we are in this idea of male and female, and anything outside of that has to be dealt with and has to be healed. So if we think about the blues and the pinks, number one, I think it's really, really interesting to mention. Pink was not a girl color until ultrasounds could tell you before someone was born whether you were a boy or a girl. Pink actually used to be for boys. So there's nothing like in the brain that ties XX genes to the color pink. And so just think about that for a moment. Like we create these things, we create these ideas, and then we pretend they're like fact. But they can actually be manipulated by society. And ultimately, the pink thing is a capitalistic thing, right? Like if we sell pink things to girls and then the family has a boy and they need blue things, we're gonna sell twice as many things. Anyways, that has nothing to do with anything. I just think it's really interesting. Okay, so we've got our pink box and our blue box, and this is kind of the way things where, like if you think about like the second bustle period, 1912 Edwardian period, where like everything that people wore were like hyper gendered, right? So like you had the bustles and you had the corsets, and men had the like boxy suits. It was like women did not wear pants ever. So it was like strict. Like this is the boundary. Now we don't live in that world anymore. Maybe we live in a world maybe a little bit more like this, right? So like we've got a little bit more of a gradient. There's a little bit more of you can do this and you can do that. But the problem is, if we're looking at a gradient, and this is one of the most significant barriers for camps, is if you're still operating on two gender system, but it's a total gradient, where do you draw the line? This is the main question that I walk camps through. Where do you draw the line? What is male? What is female? When ultimately there's nothing truly essential about being male or female. Like there's not one single thing that all men have in common. There's not one single thing that all women have in common. So this especially is dangerous, number one, in sleeping situations. And number two, which is just such a heated debate, is in sports. So there's a sprinter who ran in the Olympics. Her name was Caster Semenya. She was an 800-meter runner. When they tested the level of testosterone in her blood, they said she had an unnatural advantage when her body naturally produced more testosterone than other people. So we're calling it an unnatural advantage, right? Like she's outside the box. We got to get her back in the box. So for her to run, they required her to take a medication that lowered her testosterone levels if she was going to run with the women. Like this is how messy it can get when we're drawing that line. So anytime we draw the line, ultimately, like somebody's going to be left out. And then if you really think about the way gender looks, it doesn't even look like a gradient from male to female, because there's no limit to the way gender presents itself or the way humans interact with gender. So if this is the model, I mean, we think it was complicated to divide up the blue and pink model. If this is the model, who knows where the line goes? All right, so let's talk quickly about the acronym. L is for lesbian, G is for gay, B is for bisexual, T is for transgender, Q is for queer, I is for intersex, which we just learned about in depth, and A is for agender or asexual. The only thing that I want you to know about this is most of the time after the LGBT, a lot of people don't know what those last letters stand for, but they're all equal and valid identities. One thing I always tell people is if you are going to say this acronym, if you are going to say this acronym, if you're going to be somewhere where you're advocating, please practice how to say it, because people get nervous. I get nervous saying it. And so, you know, it's not uncommon that somebody would say like, and the LGBT, and because they get so nervous that they can't say it, which also, it kind of makes it feel like it's a joke, or you didn't do your homework, or the identities that are at the down end of the spectrum aren't as valid or important. So that's your homework. Learn how to say this. It's important. It's important to be able to kind of rattle it off the tongue. All right. So again, why do you need to know any of this? Why are these things so complicated? You know, like, what if somebody comes up to me and says that they're a pansexual transmasc person? What does it mean? Why? So I really wanted to break down the reasons that you would need to know and what you would need to do with that information. So sexuality is something that you would probably want to know if you were going to have a romantic connection with the person. You would need to know if they have asked for your support, regarding their sexuality. Again, like they're coming to you, they're driving the bus. And if you are a clinician that needs to know for a medically relevant reason, I cannot think of a medically relevant reason that your camp healthcare provider would need to know someone's sexuality. So in all intents and purposes, sexuality is not something that you need to know. Like you don't need to put what's your sexuality on their health card. You would want to create an environment where you're supporting people of all sexualities that doesn't particularly like center heterosexual identities. But other than that, like it's not something that you really need to know about or be able to know exactly what a aromantic person is. Now, gender is a little bit more important for us in camp. Number one, you want to know somebody's gender, so you know what pronouns to use for that person. Again, that's a direct way that you can show support for a transgender or gender nonconforming person. Now, that being said, there's this caveat that gender doesn't always equal pronouns. So like I could identify as female, but want to use they, them pronouns, or I could identify as male and want to use she, her pronouns sometimes. So we can't just, it's not that simple that gender equals a certain set of pronouns. Just like sexuality, you would want to know about someone's gender identity if they've asked for your support surrounding their gender identity. If you're a clinician that needs to know for a medically relevant reason, and there are hours of conversation that goes into, does your camp healthcare provider need to know someone's sex assigned at birth? Which again, it is the thesis. But the other reason you would want to know is if you're actively working to affirm their gender identity. So I think the biggest thing that people want to know about gender identity, again, is where do they sleep? What group do they go with? And so there are ways to ask that that are a little bit more cordial or polite or safe than some of the ways we kind of see it traditionally asked. These are some things to delete from your vocabulary. All right, so we don't preferred pronouns. Okay, so genders and pronouns, they're not a preference. I prefer pepperonis on my pizza, but my pronouns are he, him, his. So they're not preferred. It's not a preference. Like it's truth. Transsexual is not a word that is used really anymore. It's outdated, and even more than that, it was seen more as a pathology, something that was in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So like something that was wrong with people. Transgendered is incorrect because transgender is an adjective and transgendered is a verb. Biological sex. So biological sex is based on 5 different factors: your internal and external genitals, your hormones, your genes, and the way your hormones present themselves. So when you say biological sex and then you say male and female, I'm like, I don't know how to answer that question. Like, what are you getting at here? All of this is, if you're going to ask these questions, should always be rooted in why are you asking and what are you going to do with that information? You don't ask for a person's real name because their real name is whatever name that they asked you to call them. And then passing, which is, it was this idea that once you reach a certain stage of your transition, then you pass, right? So like, I am a passing male because I have this fabulous beard. But that assumes that there's a state of becoming that one reaches or doesn't reach. And then there's like the privileges that come along with that, which there are. But I think what you're looking for is like read as male or read as female. And then the problem with male and female identified is that it assumes that you need to know something beyond just male or female. So you wouldn't need to say like all female identifying people, like just say all female people. You don't need to add that identifying qualifier because that assumes that some people are like not actually female. All right. The other thing that I learned when I work with camps is the first questions I'm often asked don't actually have anything to do with transgender kids. It has to do with other people. Like we're not even centering trans kids in our conversations about trans kids. Common questions I get asked. What if a family what if families are uncomfortable with a transgender person being in the cabin with their camper? So what do I do about that? When maybe what we should be asking is, how do we create a safe space that is safe for all youth, regardless of sex assigned at birth? So again, that question is centering the trans person, and we're taking care of them before we're taking care of the families that are uncomfortable. How do trans girls threaten an all-girl environment is a question that I often hear. And when we maybe should be asking ourselves, how do we help a trans girl feel cared for and prioritized in an all-girl environment? And then another question I often get asked is, how will we make space for staff that just don't agree with this? And what we should be looking for is, how do I teach my staff that we believe in the sacred worth of all people in all their forms? So you can just see how it takes a little bit of pressure off when you really are centering that trans person in that conversation, and really looking at their safety over kind of the impact to the rest of the community, which is of course important. You're running businesses, you got to put, people in the tents. But if you come at it from a place where you're centering that child that so desperately needs this experience, the other stuff kind of falls into place a little bit more, and might give you that bravery that you need. So this is a little bit, this is from the 2015 transgender survey, which is the largest survey ever done on trans folks. The last one prior to that was 2010. So we're hoping in the next couple of years, we'll have more statistics based on what's happened between 2015 and 2021, because that's a lot has happened since then. But this is a little bit of information I wanted to share with you all as a Christian organization. Transitioning can be such a spiritual time, as you feel like you're kind of becoming someone that God always intended you to be. But we don't always find the outlets in spiritual communities to have that conversation, which I think one thing that I was telling Vicki this, one thing I love about this group is I don't feel like I have to convince you that trans folks of sacred worth. I get to work with you on how we show them that they're of sacred worth, because so many trans folks, that's not the message that we always get. So as you can see in this figure 5.23, people leave a faith community not only because they're rejected, but because they're afraid of being rejected, right? Like they're not even sticking around to take a chance. So how do we overcome that as people of faith? Like, how do we love louder? How do we make sure that every single person knows that they're going to be welcome in our space, especially when there's so many prevalent narratives about Christians that they're going to devalue trans folks, or they're going to reject trans folks. Like trans people are pretty vulnerable, especially when it comes to spirituality. And then you look at figure 5.25, and those are the figures for people who actually left a faith community because they were actually rejected. And as you can see, all of this, as is many things that we talk about when we talk about trans folks, is compounded by race. So there's even privilege within the trans community, as far as a white trans person, I don't experience the same oppressions as a Black trans woman of color. So that the marginalization just becomes more and more prevalent and more dangerous. All right, so what does your camp, or what camps were built with trans people in mind? Not very many. So I don't know if you've ever retrofitted plumbing in your bathroom. It's very difficult to retrofit anything. And like, that's what we're doing here, right? Like it's an overhaul of the system, because when these camps were built, they weren't built with trans people in mind. So let's go through some of the things that you can do to really bring out the inclusion side of your camp. Forms are huge. Forms are often a barrier. The way you talk about gender, the way you talk about sexuality, the way you talk about parents, especially on medical forms, those can be incredibly sensitive because there's so much trauma that occurs with trans folks interacting with medical systems. Gatekeeping is the idea that someone outside of yourself who has more authority than you can choose or not choose to validate your gender identity. This manifests at camp in like requiring parents permission for a bunk reassignment if someone, you know, is transitioning from one gender to the other and their parents aren't accepting. Like we saw, only 31% of parents actually accept this fact. Or like they're requiring someone to use their legal name. Please don't ever require anyone to use their legal name. Legal names are incredibly hard to change. I don't know how it is in Canada. I actually had to take an ad out in the paper when I changed my name that had to run for 3 weeks with my dead name and then my new name, which is just, it's horrible. So if anybody asks you to call them meatball because maybe meatball wants to be called that because they're not ready to be called Brian. And that's kind of like a transitional name. So representation, like we so often talk about we ask our staffs not to talk about their gender identities, but it is so important that kids who are trans have representation of trans people in order to understand that like they're going to grow up to be adults, like they're going to survive whatever it is that they're living through. The other important part of representation that doesn't get talked about as much, as it's just as important for kids who are not trans to see trans people like live in their truth and excited and embraced and live in their life. You know, representation is important for everyone. The longer we don't represent different types of people, the longer that people they're not going to become comfortable with something that's not represented. A seat at the table, again, we kind of already talked about this. We already touched on this. It is so important that trans folks are in these conversations when you're making these decisions. And not like, don't just pick like a random trans person, like somebody who has an expertise, a local LGBTQ organization. There's the Pride Camping Association. Our group does work with camps. So just kind of thinking about who can I ask? Who will have this expertise? The other part of this is you don't want to speak for trans people, right? Like, because if you've done trans inclusion at your camp and you didn't vet your policies, you know, with someone with expertise in the area, you know, it might, and then you're presenting yourself as the expert, right? Like we've had a trans kid, like it went awesome. You know, like it's important to let trans folks speak for themselves. Binary policies so hard at camp because camps are so traditional. They're so important. Traditions, they're huge, and a lot of them are grounded in binary gender. So then we have to ask ourselves, like, what is that tradition serving? And if it's a tradition that's harmful to any portion of the community, it's not a worthwhile tradition. Like, think of a different way to co-opt that tradition so that it is more fair and it is more equitable and it fosters growth for all people in your camps. Lack of training, again, like we're just getting people to talk about this. Staff need to be trained in how to talk with gender inclusive language, how to identify gender-based bullying. You know, what happens when a kid comes out at your camp? What does that conversation look like? Because like you got one shot at that. It is so common that kids come out at camp because they are safe. You are creating communities of safety and they feel like they want to share this thing for the very first time. And if your staff is like, has no idea what to do with that, like that's one shot, like you get one shot at that. So teaching staff how to react with affirmation. Segregated facilities. Again, this goes back to like the budget piece of it. How do we physically retrofit our camp to make sure that everybody is safe? I don't know about you. We never had like a capital budget to build a gendered unsegregated shower house. So what are the things that we can do to make sure that we're doing what we need to do? And then the last thing that we talk about is fear and shame, right? So our trans campers are coming into our space with fear and shame. I mean, it's part of our culture, whether they're ashamed of what their parents will think, or they're afraid of what's going to happen. Like, they're going to carry that with them. They will be afraid the first time they go swimming at your camp, because it's such a vulnerable time. They're going to be afraid they're going to be rejected. Like, we have to make sure we're putting that they don't need to be afraid and they don't need to be ashamed. So this often happens where you say, well, we don't have any trans kids. Like, we haven't experienced this yet. But the thing is, the most recent study on population density of trans youth, or kids that identify something other than cisgender, is 2%. So 2%. So again, like, if you had 100 campers, 2% of those are going to be transgender or come to realize that they are transgender. So just because they don't know yet doesn't mean that we shouldn't make sure that we're doing everything within our power to create a safe space, so that when they're ready, that they know that they don't have to feel fear and they don't have to feel shame. So maybe they haven't come out yet. And the question that you have to ask yourself is, did we create a culture where that person felt safer, or did we create a culture where they're going to feel less likely or more scared to talk about it? So even if you don't have any trans campers, maybe you're that special camp that has none. You still have families that might have trans parents. So this is something that I'll never forget. There was this, and this isn't a trans story, but there was a girl, I was working at Girl Scout camp, and she was dragging her, she was like hiking up the hill, and she was all tired, and her sleeping bag was dragging on the ground behind her. And this counselor said to her, your mom and dad are going to be really upset when you come home with that dirty sleeping bag. And luckily that kid was a confident kid and said, I don't have a mom and dad. I have two moms. But like, she should have never had to do that. Like, it's awesome that she could and that she had the bravery to do it, but we can't just assume anything about folks parenting. And if we do, again, we're setting up this situation where like heterosexual marriages are the default, and anything other than that is like maybe something that we'll talk about like in a special interest session or something. Like, all families are beautiful and all families are valid, and we should treat them that way. So unique situations that might come up. You might have a camper who comes to your camp for the first time as a gender other than the gender that they were assigned at birth. You might have a camper who returns to your camp with a gender presentation that differs from the previous year. You might have a camper who comes out as transgender or gender non-binary, who believes that they might have supportive parents at home. And then you might have campers who come out as transgender or gender non-conforming, who believe that their parents will be unsupportive and even dangerous. So obviously, like, all of these things are different considerations to think about when you're thinking about policies, when you're thinking about privacy. So troubleshooting, as soon as word gets out that you're going to do this, like, there are going to be people who are upset with it, and that absolutely doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. That means that you have to be strong in doing it, and you have to stand behind what you're doing, because again, what is it rooted in? Saving lives. And it's okay to say that to people. Like, you can remind people that creating a safe space and affirming that child could save their life. You can front load that your space is accepting, like, be out there and be bold about it. And then parents aren't going to be confused. It's not going to be a surprise. Assure the person, the camper, without involving them. So like, you're going to go to bat for them, and they need to know that. But you don't have to involve them. Again, just shut down any inappropriate conversations. There's a secondary trauma that occurs when a kid experiences an instance of bullying, and then the secondary trauma comes in when nobody does anything about it. So that's one of the most important and salient things that you can do, is shut it down. don't turn the other way. We do that too often because we don't know what to say, so we don't say anything, and that's possibly the worst thing that you can do. So you can be their lifeline. Again, it takes one affirming adult to cut a camper or a youth's suicide rate in half just by showing up and just by being supportive. So that was me talking way too fast. I hope that you guys got something out of that. I'm open to taking questions or comments, or whatever you have. You can put them in the chat. I think Joe is going. He's going to moderate, right, Joe? Right, Joe?
Yeah, I have. The questions have been answered by people who are already in the chat.
Oh, great! Awesome.
If you have a question, you can feel free to unmute and just say the question, because I can't see everybody on one screen right now. Oh.
All right.
Great.
I stopped my share so I can see faces. You're all beautiful. Thank you for being here tonight.
Perfect. There's a round of applause, very silent applause going with everybody.
I like it. I like it.
Yeah.
I love it. I can't wait to be back in person, y'all. Like, I used to do these things like sitting down, and I was like, I can't do that anymore. I have to stand up. So thanks for watching me pace around my living room.
It's great. There was an important point brought up in the chat. In Canada, we use 2S as well. So 2S.
Yes.
LGBTQIA+.
Yes.
I'm not sure it'll roll off my tongue. My question to you would be, does it have to be letters, or is there at some point, do you think it'll get to be a word that represents all of like a sound?
Yes. Yes. So I think that's a difficult question, because who knows where we're going. I often shorten it to the queer community, but again, like, that's something that can be really loaded for elders in the LGBTQIA plus community, because it was such a negative word for so long. So I don't know if we'll ever get to a point where there's like a single word. The best thing that could happen is that there's no word, that it's not necessary, that we're all just people living our lives. And I think that that's the goal of everything, is to just do these things and be nice to people regardless of what initial their identity starts with.
That's great. Thank you.
Can I ask a question, Joe?
Yeah.
I was just going to ask, like, or something I've been thinking about, and you kind of touched on, Chris, but when, like, you want trans and, gender nonconforming folks at the table when you're making policy decisions. But the thing, like, I actually turned to you a few months ago when I was trying to rebuild our registration form, because I feel like the out trans people in our community are so few that I don't always want to be leaning on them and being like, hey, token trans person, answer my questions. And so I'm just wondering, like, if you've come across that with other camps, or like how to navigate that in a way that is both like including their voices, but also not taking advantage of them.
Sure. I think that is such a fine line, right? Like, and is also, and that's something I talk about often, it's even more difficult when it's people on your payroll, right? Because no matter what, if they're on your payroll, there's an expectation there for them to, like, quote unquote, behave, right? And on top of that, if they come to you and they say, like, well, this accommodation would make me feel safer, and you're like, no, we're not going to do that. Like, think about what that says to that person is, I said would make me safe, and you said no, thank you. So I think there's that to think about. Now, the other part to think about is, like, it's got to be a consenting thing, right? So, like, I am a control freak, and I'm honest about this. Like, if there was trans stuff happening at my organization, like, I wanted to be involved, and, like, that's the way that I process, right? So I think always giving the opportunity, but with the understanding that, yes, if this is not your wheelhouse, if this is not something that you're comfortable with, please say no. I think another really interesting thing to do that I've done for camps before is to create a panel with your trans campers or staff, and then have them work with a professional, like, as your think tank, right? So, like, involve someone from a local organization, a local LGBTQ organization who can kind of advocate for what that group of people want, but they don't have to do it themselves, right? So like you've got that expert, you've got that person who might have like a social work degree or a gender studies degree, or is doing this work in the field, but they're working directly with the people in your community who know the specifics of your community, if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you.
Yeah.
If I might, I have a question.
Yeah, Jill.
Hi, Chris. Thank you for the
Hello.
presentation. It was really informative. So your statistics that you used back at the beginning, though, would it be fair, correct, to say that those are self-reported statistics, and so in reality they could be quite different and higher?
Absolutely. So that specific study was done by the Trevor Project, which is an organization, and their research is pretty. It's good. I mean, we always look to organizations that have good research, but yeah, it's self-reported, and I would venture to say that it's probably worse than even that, because everyone just like, they don't want to talk about this stuff. They're embarrassed, even if it's completely confidential, right? Like even the chance that their parents could possibly know about it would be enough for some kids to run the other direction. So I think that's a really relevant point for sure. Other questions?
Hi, Chris.
Hi, Tammy.
So my camp is in a bit of a unique situation. I shouldn't say my camp. Our regional churches camp, our regional councils camp is in a unique situation because we rent our space from another camp that runs full time.
Okay.
Thankfully, we have not run up against any barriers where we have been told that, I'm sorry, no, we can't rent to you because our policy states X, or, oh, we have a certain gender policy that we have to abide by. But I think going down the road, especially for those camps that don't have a physical space, these are conversations we will probably have to get into down the road, especially with some church bodies who have their physical space, their understanding of the LGBTQ to spirited IA plus community is not as broad, if you will, as others.
Yeah.
And so do you have any suggestions for resources that camps like the one I'm a part of could access to help facilitate some of these conversations down the road,
Yeah, I think as far as resources go, there's the Pride Camping Association. And they are currently working on a project that I'm involved with where they're trying to develop standards. So basically, like, these are the standards that you should be following to exhibit that you are an inclusive and affirming camp for LGBTQ folks. So I think that's going to be really important. Something else that I have found recently in working with camps is that camps will say, I recently had this conversation where somebody said, well, I'm from Michigan, and in Michigan, our licensing doesn't allow for multiple genders to sleep in the same space or something. And I said, well, who said? Like, where is that? And I think that's the thing that you have to get to, is like, where is that policy based? And the truth was, that wasn't an actual policy. Like, their licensed person had told them this, and there was no basis in their actual policy. So anytime you have folks where you're running up against that, I think it's always important to say, like, show me in your policy where it states that, and let's talk about it. Especially if you're renting from others. I think that as this conversation continues, people will be, it's like you start to talk about it, and then people start to talk about it from the other side too. So like it kind of like builds up. But I think asking to see their policies, and then I'm not a lawyer. I'm certainly not a lawyer in Canada. But what is legal? What can they legally say as as a user group, what crosses the line into discrimination would all be things that I would think about and look into. So I think the Pride Camping Association would be good. We're always willing, as Transplanting is always willing to do research on your behalf and have those discussions. That's kind of our scope of work. So, there's folks out there who are having the conversations, but I think that is not one that I had thought of. So I really appreciate that question. The user group question. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Robin, go ahead.
Robin, hello.
Hi, I just want to share something. We have the most hideous binary washroom ever.
Mhm.
And
Owning it. I love it.
yeah. So last summer, when we were closed for COVID, we started constructing a new washroom. And we didn't get it finished, and we kind of ran out of money. So we were hoping for one more year out of our hideous washroom. And I would like to show you all a picture of what God thinks of our hideous washroom. So it's in my background.
Oh, no.
Yeah, flattened it, cut the building right in half. Hopefully the insurance company will give us the cash for it, and we can finish our new one. But I
love it.
Ripped up by the roots. The tree just smashed it. The boys' side and the showers.
I love it. It's mysterious ways.
In the chat, I put stalled.online, which is a group of architects based out of California, I believe, which is the idea that you don't have a binary washroom. You have one washroom facility that serves everyone. Separate rooms for toilets, separate rooms for showers, and then sink bays that everybody can use. Watch the video. It's I think there was a 99% Invisible podcast on it, and it's super awesome.
That's one of my favorite podcasts, Joe. 99% Invisible.
I know that we are, Chris, thank you so much. I know that we're at the end of time. We're 4 minutes over. If you need to leave, feel free. If you had other questions for Chris, Chris seems like he is willing to stay and answer some questions, and I'm willing to keep recording. This will go up on YouTube when my slow internet allows, sometime later this week. But feel free. So if you need to leave, don't feel bad. We'll miss you. But anybody have any questions, additional questions for Chris? Or really tired?
Chris, promote the transplanting courses you have for camps really quick.
Sure.
Because they look really good, and I think they'd be valuable for folks.
Yeah, so we do, like I said, we do a 12-month course calendar range. That really gets into the nuts and bolts of everything. So like tomorrow night, I'm hosting a doctor who's going to talk about trans healthcare at camp and how to do your forms properly. So I'm so excited about it. She's an excellent human. But so last week we did one that was specifically on single gender camps, because there are other things that are so important to know about single gender camps and inclusion. Well, we talk about all gender housing, how to train your staff, how to help with transitioning staff members. We do it all. The other part of our courses is we also we're looking for intersectional speakers. So the folks from S'more Melanin, who works on racial justice at camps, are coming to do a session, and then we are having a session on restorative. So we're really trying to put together a coalition of speakers who can really speak to many different types of identities, how we keep people safe at camp, and everything there. So it's fun. It's a laid back environment. This is what I look like all the time. So we're not too buttoned up. It's great. We do subscriptions. You can buy the whole year package. You can buy them just a la carte, one off. So okay, the commercial. I hate it, Vicky. But yeah, thank you for the opportunity to talk about the work that I'm doing outside of here.
Awesome, Colleen.
Yeah, I just want to say, to add on to Chris's commercial, I've been to a few of his sessions. and I subscribed for the year-long membership, and it has been so fantastic and so worth it. So if you're like go, just go and do the thing and like learn it, because Chris has been an incredible teacher thus far, and I expect will continue to be.
Thank you.
I know that I can tell. I know what it's like to not want to self-promote.
Yeah.
So I wanted to do a bit of promoting for Chris to say it's been awesome so far.
Well, thank you, Colleen. I appreciate that. But thank you all for coming to this conversation. It was wonderful. I appreciate everything that you're doing. So if there's any other ways I can support you or your camps, I'll put my email in the chat in case anybody's looking for me. And I'm always open to chatting. I love brain teasers. The harder the better. We'll figure it out what's the best for everyone. So thank you all for being
so much,
here.
Chris. Kathy, did you want to speak to what a firm is briefly?
Like the Affirm Network for the United Church Canada.
What would it mean for camps to be?
Well, I just saw, I think it was Harry that asked, and it did make me wonder how many of our camps are reaching out to Affirm or using Affirm to help them with this work. Or
Kathy, can I jump in, Kathy, really quickly?
Yeah.
So I put it in the chat, so for those who don't know me, my name is Mallory. I'm on the national board for Affirm United right now. I recently joined. And one of the projects I'm interested in taking on for Affirm is looking at the affirming process and how it would work for camps. Because right now it is developed for ministries, for the congregations and churches, and camps are very different beasts. And so one of the things that we're working on is looking at how we can take that process and make it specific to camps. So that is in the works.
It's so good. It is so good.
That's great to know.
So our camps need to hear that is when you've got something concrete. That's awesome.
Mallory, can you keep us up to date on that as it moves forward?
Yep.
Okay. That's awesome. I think being 8:40, we're only 10 minutes over, and we know that it is 9:40, or if you're in Newfoundland, it's 10 after 10.
Whew.
And on the West Coast, you guys are just missing dinner. So we'll go from there. But thank you so much, Chris, and we appreciate it. And it is super important work that you do, and I hope to be able to roll it off my tongue at some point in my life.
You'll get there. You'll get there.
Yeah. I will. Thanks, everybody. I will have the recording up shortly, and we will go from there. We don't know what next month is yet to talk about, but stay up to date. We'll get on it. So have a great night.